Hello there and welcome to another BoBeats synthesizer review. Today we're checking out a new synth here from IK Multimedia, the Uno SYNTH PRO. And it's quite intriguing. You might remember the Uno synth. It was this small and inexpensive synthesizer that came out a couple of years ago. Monophonic kind of bass lead synthesizer. It was quite well received in general, people seemed to like it. It wasn't a personal favorite of mine, but I did recommend it in a few videos as sort of a cheap synthesizer for a hardware synth setup. Really good for bass lines, really good for lead sounds, and it had quite an interesting sequencer with a lot of potential. So when IK Multimedia got in touch and asked if I wanted to check out their Uno SYNTH PRO, I got quite intrigued, because I always felt like the Uno synth and the Uno drum had a lot of untapped potential. But because it's a budget instrument, of course corners had to be cut somewhere. So what if they had a bigger budget and could make a more expensive synthesizer? What would it be like? Well, the answer is here, right in front of us. The Uno SYNTH PRO. There's this desktop version here, really tiny, very compact, and this keyboard here, which is actually a lot heavier and a lot better built than you might think from just looking at pictures of it. Remember that how things look on camera isn't always telling of how it feels when you have it in your hands. The desktop version is very plasticky, whereas the keyboard version is very nice with this aluminum chassis. Feels good, heavy, nice keybed as well. So in today's video we're gonna take a look at both of these. They are the same, remember that. It's the same sound engine, they sound the same, they have the same features except for the obvious physical differences. But we're gonna take a look at them, listen to some sound demos, I'm gonna do an overview, maybe a patch from scratch, go over the sequencer, stuff like this. Talk about some of the negatives as well, because there are a few. So without further ado, let's get into it. So what is the Uno SYNTH Pro? Well, it's a 3-oscillator analog synthesizer. So the oscillators are analog, the VCF and VCA are analog, and the effects are of course digital. And you can do chords on it. You can play chords because it has a paraphonic mode. Now I'll talk a little bit more about that later in today's video. Basically it means that you can play chords but with limited articulation. But I did find that I was making quite a lot of pad sounds with it because of the stereo effects as well. So it's a versatile little synthesizer, and just to kind of show you some of the beef, here is a little beat that I made with it. Let's do a little overview here. On this side here we have different buttons that lets you access different parts of the synthesizer. So oscillator for changing out the sound. So a nice thing with oscillators is that you can change the wave shape very easily. So changing the pulse width here of this square wave here, and then we have more of a sawtooth going into triangle. And this goes for all 3 oscillators. And in mix, we can change the levels of the oscillators and add noise. And in filter, we access the 2 different filters. And this is actually quite a unique feature on a synthesizer in this kind of price range, where you have 2 analog filters. We then have access to 2 LFOs here, filter envelope, amp envelope, and the mod matrix, which is actually a lot deeper than you might think. You have a lot of different sources and destinations that you can set up in the mod matrix, which is really nice. And this is one of the unique features here with the synth, is that it's quite open. So if you compare it to, say, a Korg Minilogue, for example, which I do like a lot, it's very fixed in what you can do. The routings are very fixed. Here it's much more open-ended. So of course that's a polyphonic synth, this is a paraphonic synthesizer, but just the fact that it's more open in terms of its design lets you do slightly wilder things. And then we have effects, which is drive. We have a mod effect like chorus and such, and delay and reverb, and they can also be edited as well. There's a ton of different options there of what you can do with them. So that's kind of neat. Next up, we're gonna dive a little deeper into this synthesizer. And first I wanna create a couple of different sounds so you get a feel for the workflow. And then I'll also touch on the sequencer and arpeggiator, because the sequencer is actually quite interesting, so stick around for that. But first off, let's just make a simple bass sound from scratch so you get an idea of how easy it is to create it on this synthesizer. So we start off with the simple waveform. Let's do something square-like. Then I want to mix in oscillator 2. And I'm gonna make oscillator 2 into a sawtooth, I think. And now we want some bass to this sound. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna go into mix, turn up oscillator 3 level, go back to oscillator, hit it again, go down to tuning, and tune it down. Because it's an analog synth, we of course want to work with detuning. So we can actually go to oscillator again, we can detune the first oscillator and see what it sounds like. So we already have a beefy sound. Now, of course, what we can next is use the two filters. So remember that I said that the two filters have different settings. So filter 1 here, we can turn into a high pass. So I'm gonna do a high pass here. And we use the resonance on the first filter to boost the frequencies that we set here using the cutoff. And then we can go into filter number 2, and that's a low pass filter. It's also resonant. Can get kind of screamy, but there is also very nice sweet spots. Next up, we want to use the filter envelope to control the second filter. Not the first one, it's a high pass. We want that set just boosting certain bass frequencies. And instead, we want to use the filter envelope here to control filter number 2. I'm just gonna set something up here at random. We're gonna tweak it a bit. So we go back to filter and we set the envelope amount here, say -41 or something. And on this bass sound, I want to set up a matrix routing that uses the aftertouch. So we basically just go here to matrix and we select mod 1. So that's the first mod slot. And then we select aftertouch here as the source. And what could we possibly trigger? I don't know, but let's see here. So we can see here under destination that there's a ton of different destinations here. I'm just scrolling through them. You can see there's a lot here to choose from. Drive amount, I'm not sure. Let's try it. Not sure if that fits. Let's instead set aftertouch to cutoff. So that can work. And next up, let's add some effects to the sound. Let's add drive. Let's add some chorus. Pretty gnarly. So I think that's pretty much done. Hit store, hit it again, saved it, you can rename it. And yeah, that's how you make a bass sound. Next up, let's do a pad sound just to show you a bit more of the effects and what you can do with it. And then we'll take a look at the sequencer, and then we'll talk about build quality and some other stuff. So to create a pad sound, we do something similar. We increase all 3 oscillators here in the mix, and we change the voice mode here to paraphonic. Now, when you do a pad sound, you can blend different waveforms, but generally speaking, it sounds a little bit better if you keep them sort of close to each other in terms of waveforms. So let's do. Let's change the amp envelope here. So next up we have the filters, and I've set filter 1 here to a high pass, and filter 2 is a low pass. But they're running parallel to each other, so with the bass sound I had one filter feeding into the other, but with this pad sound I have them running beside each other. So this means that I could, for example, set up an LFO here to control one filter cutoff and another LFO to control the other filter cutoff. Now next up I want to use the matrix, and I've set it up to use LFO 1 to control the cutoff. And I'm going to set up a second modulation here, so mod 2. We're going to use LFO here. Let's see here. LFO2, and we're gonna do oscillator wave. I'm gonna set up a third one, LFO2 to oscillator 2 wave. Let's add some chorus delay and reverb. But it is important to note that this is a paraphonic synthesizer, not a true polyphonic one. And that's because there's only one voice actually. So we're playing the 3 different oscillators on 3 notes. So one oscillator, second oscillator, third oscillator. And this is similar to something like the Poly D from Behringer, for example, but different from something like the Minilogue XD or original Minilogue, because they are actually true polyphonic. They have much more articulation, so just keep that in mind. So you can do pads, but with limited articulation. Now, before we talk about the sequencer and the build quality, here's a word from today's sponsor, DistroKid. Here's 5 reasons to try out DistroKid. Firstly, you sign up for about $20 a year and you can upload unlimited amounts of music. Secondly, it's really quick and easy to upload. Basically, anyone can do it without any prior knowledge. 3, there are different tiers of subscriptions. So if you want to release your music under, say, different artist names, or if you're starting a label, DistroKid has an option for you. 4, DistroKid lets you upload to relevant stores and streaming services such as Spotify and iTunes, and it doesn't take long for the music to be available in the stores. 5, there's also the hyperfollow feature, which automatically creates a custom page where people can find out where to buy or listen to your music, and I personally really like this feature. So go and check out DistroKid using my link in the description. You get a little discount and you support the channel. Next up, let's talk about the sequencer, because it's actually quite interesting. And here's a little groove. This is a preset. So if I play the keyboard, we have the 808 style kick drum here. And what we also have is a few steps where there are this more snare-like sounds. And we can actually go into sequencer here. So sequencer, press record. And now we could actually press Alt, use copy, and paste some stuff around like this. Suddenly we have some more kicks. Let's copy the snare like this. So that's how easy you can copy and paste different steps. You just hit Alt, use copy and paste to copy and paste different steps, which makes this very useful once you've set up different automations or parameter locks per step. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You might be asking yourself, parameter locks per step, automations, what are you talking about? Let's go to an empty preset here and let me show you. Let's see if we can make some kind of kick drum. This is nice. So now in order to record this, we could either hit record and play. Now we're live recording. Or we can just hit record, hold down a step, hit the note that we want. And we need to make the steps longer. So we just hold down a step, turn this knob here, length, increase the length. And instead of doing for each individual step, hit Alt, hit copy, and paste. Let's say we want to alternate between this kick sound and this. We can just hit record and we'll change the first note here. So we're changing the filter envelope decay a bit, and then we're turning it down for the rest of the steps. So it's not as precise as, say, an Electron sequencer, but you can get pretty granular with your control of parameters per step. So next up, let's add some kind of snare-like thing. And of course, to do this, we're going to use the noise generator. Now, while holding down the step, go to Mix. Let's turn down the level of all the oscillators and turn up the noise generator. And turn up the cutoff for both of the filters. And we can go and change the length. And as you can see here in the menu all the things that we have parameter locked. So let's change the length here. And let's copy it. Now we can of course use the other oscillators, so using oscillator number 2 here instead. Turning down the noise. So beyond being just able to live record into the sequencer, use it for say a simple bass line or something like that, you can do some decently complex sequences like this. It's actually quite useful. I find that the UI is pretty simple actually for the level of complexity that you can achieve, and it's quite a lot of fun to program. Now, it's not Electron level of preciseness, but it's also not as, say, basic as, say, a Korg Volca sequencer. So it's something in the middle. And we also have a little arpeggiator accessed with this ARP button here. It's pretty nice. We can also change direction, for example, so we're different modes for it's up, down, and so on, which is nice, but it's pretty straightforward arpeggiator. We can also change the steps here. And another thing that's nice with the sequencer is that you can actually sequence chords. So in paraphonic mode, you can sequence chords like this. When it comes to the I/O of the synthesizers, we have full-sized DIN MIDI in and out. We have stereo outputs because the effects are stereo. We actually have phones outputs for headphones, and we have audio input. So this is inputted, and I think you can actually process it through the filter and effects, if I'm not mistaken. I'll correct myself if I am. And the CV gate here, I/O. So you can actually use Eurorack to control something inside of synth or send CV and gate out of this synthesizer as well. And then we have the USB here, which can be used for power as well as data transfer. And on the module version, it's similar. I'll touch on this somewhere in the video. So let's talk build quality, because there's a substantial difference between the two of them. So the desktop version is cheaper, but it's also way more plasticky, doesn't feel as good. Whereas the keyboard version is heavy. It's actually quite heavy, much heavier than say a Korg Minilogue or Wavestate. And it's very nicely made. It's not quite up there with say the Argon 8 or Cobalt 8. I feel those are slightly better, but in terms of build, it's very solid. It has aluminum chassis, and the keybed is actually very nice. It's way beyond something like the Korg Minilogue. It's not quite up there with the Argon 8 keybed, but it's definitely a good keybed. And in terms of the knobs and buttons, the buttons are functional, works very well. The mod wheel and pitch wheel are quite nice as well, you know, nothing fancy, nothing special with them. The knobs, however, are, well, they offer resistance. They feel good to turn, but I don't like the rubberized, the coating. I'm not entirely sure what it's called, because I think you can see it even on the modular version already. It's prone to get scratched, and I do think that over time it will wear down. Now, of course, I haven't used it that long, so take it with a grain of salt. It might hold up way better than I'm telling you, but I feel like this rubberized coating here will, it won't hold up as good as on some other synths over time. So overall, I'm actually very surprised and happy with the build quality of the keyboard version. It's way better than you might think from just looking at it, whereas the desktop version is plasticky, but it's fine. I mean, just don't expect it to feel expensive when you pick it up, because it's not an expensive synthesizer for what it is, and you're actually paying for the sound, for it being an analog synthesizer, more than you're paying for the enclosure. So just keep that in mind and you'll be fine. And speaking of negatives, on the module version, not the keyboard version, I noticed that the mod wheel here wasn't all that responsive. Sometimes it wouldn't actually register. I think it has to do with how hard I touch. So sometimes when I touch more gently, I'm a gentle guy, it doesn't register. If I touch harder, it registers. So it's not a major thing, and it's probably something that can be firmware fixed. And on the keyboard version, of course, there's the physical wheel, so you don't have this issue. Now let's also talk about the elephant in the room, the micro USB. Now a lot of you don't like that, me too. I'm not a big fan of micro USB, and I would love to see USB Type-C in the future. But it is what it is. Now, one cool feature here is that you actually have two micro USBs, because one is just purely for power and one is for power and data. So the way this works is that you can have it hooked up to a computer and have it powered from a different USB port or USB to power converter like this. And the idea, from talking to the designer of the synth, the idea is that you will eliminate some of the potential issues when powering a synth from a computer USB, because you can get ground loops, humming and that sort of stuff if you're powering a module like this just from the computer. And of course on the keyboard version you only have the one micro USB, because you do have an external power brick for it and not for this one. But both can be powered using a power bank. I've tried and successfully used something like this from Anker, and that's pretty nice. It works well for both of them, but of course it will depend on what kind of USB power bank you're using, so don't cheap out, get something good. So to show you here, I'm actually powering the SYNTH PRO here with the power bank, and it works pretty well. So that's a nice feature as well on both of these devices, that you can power them using a power bank. So that was the SYNTH PRO. Let me know in the comments if this is a synthesizer for you, and also let me know if there are other synths that you want to see me check out here on the channel. I'm always interested in your feedback. So this is all that I have for you today. Hope to see you in a future video. Have a great day. Talk to you later.